Hello, everyone. This is Scott King with Becker's Healthcare. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Simplifying Operations, How Two Systems Are Reimagining Soft Tissue Robotics in the Outpatient Setting. Before we begin, I'll walk us through a few quick housekeeping instructions. We'll begin today's webinar with a presentation, and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your screen. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. You can use the same link you used to log into today's webinar to access the recording. If at any time you have issues with audio or visuals, just try refreshing your browser. You can also submit any technical questions into the Q&A box. We're here to help. We have 2 poll questions for today's presentation. If you can please take a moment to vote for each one. Poll number 1, are you currently using a robot in your facility? Poll number 2, are you currently working in or representing an ASC? With that, I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers. Dr. Ryan Broderick, Associate Professor of Surgery, General Surgeon, UCSD, Koman Outpatient Pavilion. John Burton, Vice President, Surgical Service Line, Memorial Hermann Health System. Thank you, Dr. Broderick and John, for being here today. And I'll turn the floor over to you to get us started.
All right, thank you very much. Looking forward to being here. Thank you all for having me, taking time out of your morning to kind of get to know a little bit more about how we at Memorial Hermann feel about just robotics in general and Distalmotion specifically. So as mentioned, my name is John Burton, Vice President of the Surgical Service Line for Memorial Hermann. I think it might be helpful just to give a little context. 1, on our system, if you're not from Houston, and then 2, kind of what the Surgical Service Line is, what it hopes to endeavor, and how that ties into robotics at large. So if you're not in the Houston market, we're one of 3 large health systems. We're the largest, in terms of volume, number of hospitals, encounters everything. Within the Houston market, we've got 14 hospitals. We also have a partnership with USPI, which has 27 ambulatory surgery centers in our portfolio. We're a very pluralistic model of a health system in that we've got a fairly large medical group. We have an extremely well and large partnership with UT Health and their physician group. And then we also have 5,000 or 6,000 physician strong network of private independent physicians across all specialties. So those numbers there are beyond the surgery service line, that's just in general. So 4 or 5 years ago, Memorial Hermann set out to really adopt a surgery service line, or a service line model, and we've segmented into 10 distinct service lines, across the portfolio, with the idea that we would, focus on strategy at a system level. So, we've got the surgery service line, which encompasses general surgery, bariatric surgery, colon and rectal, urology, GI, plastics, ophthalmology, ENT. Those are the big ones. There's probably a couple more ologies that I'm missing. We have cancer service line. We've got trauma. We have orthopedics, heart vascular, neurosurgery, primary care, general medicine. I think I've listed them all. women's and children. So I think those are the big service lines across. And so, we've set up and structured ourselves in such a way that, we strategically think as a network. We partner with our hospital CEOs, our local markets, but doing so in a way that really thinks about what's good for Memorial Hermann at large, and are we being thoughtful with the resources, because we've got, Houston is an 800 square mile geographic area, that serves over 3 million people in the immediate metro area. So we've got to be really thoughtful about the capital, that we're deploying. We got to be thoughtful about how we're strategically engaging with physicians and putting services in or out of, various markets. So I give you that context and framework along with our partnership with USPI to kind of set the stage for, how we think about robots and what we're doing with Distalmotion and Dexter here in Houston specifically. So I'm going to switch to the next slide. I'm not going to go through these statistics. Everyone that's on here is joined probably for a reason. You're aware of kind of, at a high level, what's happening. Different markets have different payer dynamics, but I mentioned we have a very large independent physician network. And the payers in this market, there are 4 or 5, not one single dominant payer, but there's definitely incentives that are happening to really shift and drive cases from our hospital, the lower acuity, higher volume cases from our hospitals to our outpatient ambulatory settings. That being said, we understand that right care, right side of service makes a lot of sense and sets us up for, bundle payments. We're engaged in some form of bundle payment to the tune of around 500,000 covered lives. A lot of these are more upside only risk, but we're exploring the road to value. It's been on our strategic framework for some years. And so that being said, we can't ignore these statistics whatsoever. And so I mentioned the partnership with UT Health. I have a great thought leader, Dr. Eric Wilson, who's the department chair for the minimally invasive surgery at UT Health here in Houston. I've been on the robotic steering committee since I joined this health system and started our service line. And, as such, I've been really introduced to, obviously our partnership with Da Vinci and Intuitive for many years, but went on a roadshow and just really the first year I was here, talked to the surgeons to understand what were their needs just at large. And, when it came to robotics, a couple of themes my first year here really stood out that, kind of caught my ear. And I remember meeting with several physicians in a physician lounge one morning for coffee. And one of them, I think, was over 70. And he mentioned to me, John, if it wasn't for robotics, I would have ended my career a couple of years ago. But it allows me to do 4 surgeries on a Friday. And I can go home and still play with my grandkids. I don't have the same level of pain or, injury that I might otherwise have from trying to tackle that laparoscopically. And, I'm not a clinician by background, but that really kind of rang true to me. I thought, that's interesting. Now, certainly we are a, very, I think we're the largest utilizer of the Da Vinci platform here in Houston. We have over 30 robots across our sites. We even have a couple robots in our ambulatory surgery center. So we're not shy of the robot platform. And I think within my first year of kind of being here, setting up strategic plan, which I do in partnership with various physician governance councils around the specialties, we really kind of set in motion a goal to equip our soft tissue ORs, 80% of them, with a robot of some kind by 2030. And, it was at that time that, like I said, Dr. Wilson, my thought partner in this space, kind of said, John, Intuitive's been a wonderful partner, but there's going to be a lot of new players that are going to be entering the market that's going to make this space, very interesting in the next couple of years. And so we kind of set that goal. That's been my goal for 3 years. At present, we're around 50% of our soft tissue ORs, if you count the dedicated rooms and then the ones that are kind of multi-specialty. We're about 50%. So we're on the way to achieving that kind of goal. But that being said, when I got introduced to the Distalmotion platform about a year ago or so, I think Greg Roche and I had dinner. We kind of talked about what this was, and it immediately piqued my interest because of the conversation that I had with those surgeons around just being able to operate longer duration, do more cases because of the ergonomic component there. And what they were offering with this platform to a non-clinician just really kind of struck out, and that value proposition early on was very intriguing. And so with, kind of a surgeon champion in Dr. Wilson, we endeavored to bring one to market with the first indication of hernia and at our academic medical center, but with the idea to trial it over a year or so and then expand that footprint beyond. We need the surgeon champion, and then our next endeavor now is to really look at placing and because of the additional indications, placing several additional robots at our ambulatory surgery centers to really validate the clinical efficacy of the platform and just get the feedback from the surgeons in this space. So I'm going to drive to the next slide. So this is kind of just showcasing, what we've experienced in our health system with all of our robots. We eclipsed robotic utilization over laparoscopic about 3 or 4 years ago, and it's only been steadily increasing at that time. And so, part of the goal of the surgery service line is to look at and think about recruitment into the future, understand, are we equipped to, bring on new recruits, to, be positioned to be the employer of choice, the OR of choice for our providers and also for our patients. And so, leveraging a robotic platform of some kind makes a lot of sense. And again, we were one of the first to market, to kind of bring this commercially, and looking to expand that even further, just based on, the great feedback we've had thus far. So I think another piece that was actually interesting to me, I mentioned our surgeon governance councils. It was about a year ago. We have a very robust and very engaging group that comprises of 2 surgeons from every one of our 11, acute large hospitals. And we look back at the data going back, I think it was 5 or 6 years. And this was probably just before I met Greg or got introduced to Distalmotion. And, it was kind of a stroke of luck or maybe just timing. But in that moment, we noticed and kind of saw a trend back in 2019 in the pre-COVID days. At the time, I mentioned we have 27 ambulatory surgery centers. We had, I think, a 70-30 split of outpatient hernia cases at the ambulatory surgery center, with 30% being done at our outpatient setting in the hospital. And then you kind of move into the COVID days and then move past it. And then by 2024, that number kind of shifted so much so that, our hernia, population, hernia caseload obviously grew in totality, but the mix shifted from 70-30 closer to 55-45 back into the hospital. And I can remember having just a very profound conversation, because my wife personally had not a robotic, but a laparoscopic procedure at one of our ambulatory surgery centers. And I remember thinking how fast that was. That took all of, I think, 10 minutes. Dr. Wilson was the performing surgeon. And so I asked the group, I said, what's going on, guys and gals? Why are we seeing this shift back to our hospitals for this procedure in particular? And the answer was, from a lot of the surgeons was, it's because we prefer to do those procedures on the robot. And I thought, well, that's very interesting. That's a very, obviously from an ergonomic standpoint, from a safety standpoint, for all the reasons that robots are great, that makes a lot of sense. But from a purely, resource intensive kind of thing, I thought, okay. And then I think within the next month, I was introduced to Greg at Distalmotion and introduced to this platform, and thought, wow, that's very interesting. This seems like something that could really kind of help us from a clinical efficacy, from a cost and efficiency standpoint, move those cases back to our partnership where, we're really expected to kind of drive value. And as we have a high performing primary care network, doing that in that setting makes a whole lot more sense. And so, from just getting the right placement made a lot of sense. And then secondary to that, all the surgeons that come through here, I've got a team of business development directors that work in our service line, and they partner with our recruitment team, and almost without fail, every new resident that comes out, certainly if they're trained here in Houston, is trained on a robotic platform. If they've had a fellowship, they absolutely are having some type of exposure to robotics. And so that's kind of the new expectation when you're bringing them to our market. And so every one of our acute hospitals has a robot. Like I mentioned, some have as many as 5 or 6, but everyone has at least 1 or 2. And as you're starting to see kind of this greater proliferation, greater expectation, we're going to need to have additional robotics in other settings. And you look at the utilization of that robot, and you think, does this make the most sense in this setting? This was an exciting alternative or option to trial to validate, clinically that this makes sense from a recruitment standpoint. And so we're very excited about this partnership, you know, and kind of proving this out and seeing it. And so far, the results have been very positive on the cases that we've done on our first robot. Like I said, looking forward to moving and showcasing that into our partnership with our ambulatory centers going forward. Just a couple more little keynotes there. Yeah, so everything I just mentioned is kind of highlighted there. And you all are, you know, in recruitment mode like we all are. You understand, you know, there's probably 2 or 3 jobs for every recently graduated resident. And so, you know, having the right technology at your campus, having that available, you know, kind of can be a differentiator if your competitors do not have that available. And so one of the other things too that just, you know, certainly makes a lot of sense in this space. And again, you know, we got our large health system. We have a robotic training lab, and we've had a partnership with Intuitive for, I think, a couple decades now. So, you know, a lot of training happens here in Houston locally with all of the residency and fellowship programs, and also, you know, nationally as well. That being said, you know, the existing robots are large. They have a large footprint. And I think, you know, if you have an older OR or an older hospital with older ORs, you know, that's, you know, forget the finance, you know, condition. If you just can't physically fit a robot in a room, it becomes a non-starter. And certainly when you talk about the ASC, the footprint of this is much, much smaller. And so there's not an OR in our portfolio of hospitals, some dating back to and some with ORs built in the 50s. None of the ORs that we have currently in our hospitals would be an issue to fit this platform. So that checked a lot of boxes for us. Furthermore, some of the smaller ORs and even procedure rooms that are ASCs, also from a footprint standpoint, make sense as well. So there's a lot of positives and value propositions that just from the business guy standpoint made a lot of sense from an early stage in this conversation with Distalmotion about what this platform could do. So I mentioned there, you know, very early on that our goal, you know, with our 80 ORs across is to have 80% of the soft tissue kind of covered. And, you know, we're at about the 50% mark at the current, you know, kind of pace within our system. We look across at these low acuity cases, and I think this may be a challenge to anyone that's got robots. You know, you've got kind of one cost as it is, and that cost is generally more than laparoscopically, and there's a lot of clinical benefits to use the robot over the laparoscopic. You know, Intuitive has done a great job proving out the value proposition from a clinical and quality standpoint. So I think everyone's in agreement there. But when you've got a caseload of, you know, thousands of cases that are kind of being done in your health system, the majority of which would be preferred to be done on a robot, you know, having an alternative to offer that's as compelling and able to kind of handle this type of cases makes a lot of sense. And so I kind of talked through all this strategy here earlier, but we put it in our main TMC, which is a teaching hospital, but with the idea to expand, you know, next into our ASCs. And then obviously the goal to getting 80% of soft tissue robots doesn't necessarily mean that we would only employ or deploy, you know, Da Vinci robots. We might as well deploy the Distalmotion robot. There's a lot to kind of see and determine and learn about over the next, you know, 6-12 months. And we, you know, want to be leaders in this space versus kind of waiting and see. And so that's kind of been our strategy for, you know, at least the last couple of years under the surgery service line plan. So I think that might take me to the end of my presentation. I think that, you know, we're going to wait till the end to kind of go through all the questions. But thank you all so much for the few minutes to chat today.
Thanks, John. I'll take over from here. I'm Ryan Broderick. I'm a minimally invasive surgeon at UC San Diego. I run our MIS fellowship here and run our Center for the Future of Surgery, which is our simulation institute. I'm brought on here because I was the first in the US to use the Dexter robot for inguinal hernias. I was the first to use it for gallbladders more recently and have been one of the higher volume surgeons using this platform. So I can speak to how we're using it, why it works in our ASC, and answer questions about that as we finish the day later here. So the system itself consists of a sterile surgeon console, small form factor, but that stays sterile so you can stay scrubbed in as a surgeon. That's different than our traditional Intuitive Da Vinci robot. where you have to scrub out and then scrub back in if you need to do stuff at the patient bedside. So it makes transitions for me much easier. 2 patient carts, which are your wristed and articulating instruments. They come with 5 instruments that you can see here. And then your third arm is the robotic endoscopic arm. What's nice for our ASC is you don't have to buy into the full kind of robotic ecosystem with this endoscopic arm. So whatever trocars you're already using for laparoscopic surgery can be used with this robot because it doesn't hard dock onto the ports itself. Whatever camera system you can use. So I prefer using the Stryker system. I use it in 2D, but if you have 3D options, whatever laparoscopic equipment you have, you can use. Up here. So the Dexter robot has this small mobile footprint. So we talked about some robots can't even make it into the operating room. So this fits through a standard 36-inch door and has no dedicated OR, where there's plenty of times where I've seen robots that get purchased and they just live in that room for the duration of their lifetime. This can move to any room. So it leads to that kind of flexible OR scheduling. Ortho can be in the room one day and you have gen surg in that room the next day, et cetera. We talked about the surgeon console, flexible OR workflow, so quick bedside access. So that's when I'll come back and forth to do mesh or to do clips, and that helps to the residents be trained as well. The open architecture standpoint, again, is it's port agnostic, it's camera agnostic. It's advanced electrocautery like ligature, et cetera, agnostic. And so if you have that, you can use it. Staplers, whatever you have on hand, you can use. You don't have to build a huge footprint in SPD, especially, to add more equipment, more gear, stuff that needs to be sterilized. There's no specific sterilizing instructions or equipment that needs to be built. It fits into your kind of standard sterilization techniques without a huge ask for increase of space. And instinctive design, we've got the short draping time, short docking time. We'll run through some of our numbers, what we're doing. I'm gonna jump back one slide here just so you can see this video that we have prepared for you and get a better idea of the robot itself. So that was just me. That was a robotic cholecystectomy, set up a little bit just so you can kind of see really you get that wristed motion that you expect out of robotics that helps with dexterity, helps with working in tight spaces. You can throw sutures, of course, with this, good knot tying. It helps with kind of working in those tight spaces. And so like I mentioned, we've done a bunch of inguinal hernias with this. This is some inguinal hernia numbers where we looked at the cumulative sum of differences to kind of figure out what our learning curve was for implementing the robot in our ASC. And what that does is your case time and compares it to your previous case time and then does the sum of differences. Ultimately, this is how your learning curve is identified, and at the 6 to 8 case numbers where we started to see competence and then coming back down to our standard mean after that. So it didn't take long for us to really learn how to implement this efficiently and effectively. And for our inguinal hernias, case time skin to skin was somewhere in the range of 40 to 45 minutes. That include both one side and both sides of repair. And then for gallbladders, our skin to skin case time so far has been in the order of 30 to 35 minutes with console time averaging around 12 minutes. So it helps us do these lower acuity cases in the place that we should be doing them, which is the outpatient center, and leaving those higher acuity cases inpatient that need to have hospital beds afterwards. I'll finish up there. We'll start, we'll pull the polls back up, I believe, just so we can talk to those a bit, but we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Broderick and John.
Absolutely.
For a wonderful discussion today. Before we move to today's Q&A section, we'll have one additional poll question for the audience, if we can get to that, please. In your opinion, what is the biggest barrier to ASC acquisition of a soft tissue surgical robot? Please take a moment to answer that on your screen if you can. Okay, looking at the results, 20% say OR size restrictions or requirements for a dedicated OR, and 52.5% say a beta. Thank you everyone for filling out the poll. We appreciate it. And we'll now begin today's Q&A. Audience, please feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A box on your screen. Let's go ahead and get started with the first question. When evaluating the robotic acquisition, what were the key metrics or proof points you needed to justify the investment? What concerns or questions came up internally, and how did you address them?
I'm happy to take that one. So I think I'll take that in two parts. I mean, I think obviously as a health system that's not a stranger to robotics in general, historically we've always just, really based it, we're in a growing market. I mean, I think within Houston, we have two of the fastest growing zip codes, I think, in the nation. They're both in the same exact market, actually, Katy and Cypress and Sugar Land. So, kind of the western edge of Houston is growing at, the last probably 5 years. It's definitely been double digits. It, grows in the, high 7 to 8s every year. I happen to live in that zip code, and I've seen it in the 4 years I've been here, this level of growth. So historically, a lot of the key metric has almost always been just a volume or an attraction of bringing cases into the market. As robotics have become saturated, in much the same way that, cellular phone usage and adoption is kind of, much more prevalent, that metric is no longer kind of the one we would utilize strictly when it looks to acquiring a robot. At this point, we've had so many of our ORs equipped. When we do them now, it's more just from the standpoint of staying on the cutting edge or technology. With this robot here with Dexter and Distalmotion, I think the two things that really stood out, I think the decision was made very quickly just to trial it, because like I said, I didn't see this as a direct competitor to the Da Vinci or intuitive robotic platform when I was first introduced to it. I didn't, see if they're trying to copy or out intuitive. The strategy they were trying to deploy really made a lot of sense to me. And I think there's a second question kind of in here that I'm going to touch on that I saw kind of come through, just that mentioned, around ASCs and kind of, is there a, similar goal within our platform for the ASCs to have 80% adoption? That number I say is, it could be 90%, it could be 100%. It's more of an arbitrary number and a kind of an aspirational goal to get to, just because of the recruitment and kind of retention of talented surgeons that expect, cutting edge tools. So this was a new tool that served almost like a different market that we'd really not gone after in any large or meaningful way, other than the fact that as we've added more robots and more robot trained surgeons and given additional access points, certainly those lower acuity, high volume procedures end up being done on the robot. And so this at large really, we purchased one, we purchased one out of strategic capital to really trial and clinically validate over, the next couple of years. And we hope to publish, some paper with Distalmotion on this robot, just around, the relative costs, in the space, relative to, laparoscopic procedures, to open procedures, to, the other robotic platform. And so, in the early stage, I think, that's really where we are with this. We're in the early stage of additional, competitors coming online. And so the biggest KPI here was just, proving and validating, one, that surgeons like it, they're comfortable on it. The take rate or the adoption is what we kind of want. And obviously us having a training center and having, a residency and fellowship program certainly would help with that. So it made a lot of sense there. I think in the ASC setting, at least for us, the adoption will be different. I mentioned we have a large private network, of over 5,000 or 6,000 physicians that are, average practice size of 1 or 2. So they are physician owners in our partnership with USPI. So we do, obviously have the controlling interest, but they're 49% physician owned. Every one of those 27 ASCs that we represent are, separate, tax organization with a separate governing body. So the strategy with those obviously is to validate and prove that this makes sense and there's surgeon interest in it. And then obviously once you've got a couple, a snowball effect could occur. I think in different health systems, in different markets, certainly other markets I've been in, from a payer negotiation standpoint, you might have started with brick and mortar and build your own ASCs, either through a partnership, or you've got not a physician-owned model where you really had more of an employed model, and you have the ASCs really to kind of have that site of care shift. In either one of those models, obviously the adoption might be easier to do if the health system has a complete controlling interest of an ASC. But I think that what we're hoping to prove and validate is that, this does make sense. I saw the EBITDA question, or the EBITDA kind of being the main reason that there might be hesitancy. But I mean, ultimately, what's not going to happen, at least in today's environment, if nothing ever changed, we're not going to have 80 or 90% of anyone's soft tissue ORs with a Da Vinci robot likely. So, evolution and competition and technology evolving is good for everybody. Most importantly, the patient who's on the end of this. And so I think really we'll know in about a year and a half's time, what the best KPIs are to really make sense in addition to the EBITDA piece. But I think just validating that is what we want to do as a system.
Next question. How do you think about which robot to use for which procedure?
Well, up until now, we really haven't had to think about that, right? We've had one, and because of the large and competitive nature of the private, practice physician groups and large private surgery groups, just offering the access and letting surgeons kind of do, have access to the existing robots has obviously been a strategy we've employed. But at some point, can't afford to do that everywhere. And so I think as we determine the clinical validation piece, that might help us to segment the case types and say, for this type of case, we're going to, segment that here at this setting. And again, definitely I want to have a strategy with the ASCs, but realizing that less and less, I just had a conference call prior to this one with Dr. Wilson, who's obviously the head of that minimally invasive fellowship program. And he said, the traditional laparoscopic kind of training programs, in 10 years, they'll still be there, but largely this industry that Distalmotion is in, that Intuitive is in, is going to radically, especially with AI, it's going to radically reshape kind of everything. And so I think, you're going to have more and more objective, unbiased data that's going to come off of these machines. It's going to help really have tough conversations and tough kind of meetings and, kind of forced decisions where you've really not had that great data before. You're going to have that now. And I firmly believe that we're just on the tip of the iceberg here with this. And I'm excited for the ride, honestly, to see how this is going to go.
I can chime in a little bit too on just what case volume or case load I would pick for this kind of segmentation of the market. And there's some cases where you may need a fourth arm, and that would be kind of your higher acuity cases. If I'm doing an esophagectomy or a gastrectomy and I'm inpatient, sometimes I think it's better to have a fourth arm or better assist. But for these outpatient cases where we're talking gallbladders, inguinal hernias, ventral hernias, Distalmotion is soon going to be in the OB-GYN space. You're going to see some of the first hysterectomies in the U.S. in the coming weeks. So these that can really move to the outpatient, that we know these patients are going to go home after the operation. And you don't need potentially that fourth arm. Like for an inguinal hernia, the two working arms is great. For a gallbladder, I can either have a low-level resident or a scrub tech that just holds my gallbladder retractor so I can do the rest of the work. Those are the kind of cases that are really built for the outpatient. And that's where we talk about that segmentation of the market, where you've got really high acuity stuff that needs to stay inpatient. And then you've got these other cases that can be done with a robot that doesn't have a huge data backpack, that doesn't use real AI. This one plugs into the wall in a 3-prong outlet and doesn't require a huge lift from biomed. So that's kind of how you would see it for the outpatient. And if you're talking about doing inguinal hernias with a robot, you can't do enough inguinal hernias with the traditional system and have an ROI. It's just not possible just because of the cost of the robot.
Moving on to the next question. What did your timeline look like from acquisition to first case, and what were the biggest enablers of smooth adoption?
Scott, you want to take that one, or you want me to go?
The very first, I'll let you go, and then I'll kind of tell our story here locally. So go ahead.
Yeah, sounds good. So we partnered early. We had seen this robot coming from a few years out because it's been in Europe for a while. And as part of our training center, we keep an eye on new technology coming up. So our first implementation was really a trial, and for once inguinal hernias were FDA approved. So the transition into our hospital was, went through the PVAC committee, it went through exec committee, got all the approvals, and then we have it in our standalone ASC in La Jolla. We really coordinated, since we knew we were going to be the first to use our simulation center to trial the device first, and how are we going to set up the room, how do we feng shui the room. We got there the night before and really made sure that we knew how this was going to go so we could make it go smooth. We picked our anesthesia team and our scrub techs, and ultimately it went great. Not everybody's going to have that luxury, but I think that proved that we could at least do it. And now we have insight on, okay, here's how you can do it in an outpatient center. And really, do we need to do all that major coordination for our mental health? Sure, but it's really a plug and play type of situation. And so we did it for inguinal hernias. Like I said, our learning curve was about 6 to 8 cases before we started getting back down to our expected case times, comparing our other robotic cases and laparoscopic cases. And then we've just been using it in our outpatient center ever since.
I actually was looking back to see my text messages with Greg. It was around middle of December last year. We first kind of got introduced. We had a dinner with him, his sales team, with several of our key physicians that were interested in trialing or had already tried and kind of played on the platform. I think from that time period, Greg might know the exact details, but I think, we had some internal dialogue. It might have been right before the end of the year or just at the beginning of January that we kind of inked the deal to purchase one, or maybe mid-January. I think it was delivered at the end of or middle of March, so a time period of maybe 3 months from kind of time to get it installed and kind of have everything. We had cases on the books in March, and for various reasons, patients canceled. So our first case was April 4th. So that time period of kind of talking, getting trained, getting it delivered was, basically a quarter. So, and like I said, they've added additional indications, added training with our OB-GYNs and with our, general surgeons in the lap chole space. And, we've had some really good luck with it thus far.
Next audience question. Would love to hear suggestions / recommendations on payer negotiations for ASC robotics.
Scott, I'll leave that to you. It's outside of my purview. I'm a user.
I'm not, so we certainly haven't had any negotiations specific to the Dexter robot. And I'm also, serve on the Robotics Governance Council. I don't know that we personally had any conversations around that. I mean, this is an additional tool that we've kind of acquired more, just as part of doing business. But with there only being one, and with all of our other health systems kind of having that one, that's not been an angle we've taken, at least in this market. Like I said, it's extremely competitive with, 3 other large health systems or fairly large health systems and probably 50 smaller hospital systems kind of all running around this space. We have not taken that angle, but again, once we are able to prove some clinical validation on this one, I think that it could be a game changer and certainly, might inform strategy going forward in that space. But again, I had been in several other markets where the payer and provider relationships are a lot different than this one. I think, because there are 4 large health systems and 4 large insurance plans, it does kind of create some level of, decent competition and it's not as unique in some of the other single payer, single provider kind of markets that some of you in the audience might be in that situation. So again, at the end of the day, if we can prove clinical validation, I think it does give us a leverage or discussion point that we haven't had before.
How do you convince physicians that are already comfortable with their existing robotic platform to trial this technology?
I think that's a great question. That's certainly, going to be a challenge for Dexter, Distalmotion, for any of the other numerous companies that are kind of entering to this foray in the U.S. market. That being said, having a training lab, having physicians get trained on it, obviously is certainly helpful. The physicians that have been on a platform for a long time, I think, having, again, I mentioned Surgeon Champion, I think in my opening remarks, if you've got 1 or 2 of those that, gets on it and trials it and really finds value, I think that the word of mouth piece kind of helps. And again, at least what we've seen here, surgeons would prefer to have their hernia case on the robot. They generally, and if they have access, they will. If they have access to the robot block room, that's what they'll do. It doesn't mean they're not going to do the hernia case laparoscopically. But if we provide more access, to a better tool, I think that, you might see adoption in that way. And so, again, that's part of our strategy, provided that the surgeon adoption rate and, comfort with the tool pans out. So I think that's just time will ultimately tell. I think it will happen, and we'll see that happen.
Thanks, John. I think also, from my side, we know that for any new tech, there's this adoption curve where you've got early adopters and then you've got late adopters and laggards. I think that there's going to be some people that are resistant to change because they're happy with their current system, but that current system doesn't necessarily fit within the programming of an ASC. There are going to be cases where there are going to be rooms where you can't put a robot that doesn't fit through the door or doesn't fit in the room itself. So if the question comes down to, okay, you're either going to do this laparoscopic or robotic, and here's the robotic system in that room, the surgeon's going to say, okay, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to do this case. And the form and function of this and many of the robots that will be coming down the path are somewhat similar in that you have wristed instrumentation for better dissection, better dexterity and grip, and you're going to be able to be proficient on many robots rather than just one.
Next question, how does the staff like it?
From my standpoint, staff think it's great. I've had, while we started with a very specific team, I've now had travelers that come in that join the day of that have never, prepped and draped it before. And, it fits in the room very nicely. It seems to have more space. There's a lot of space for the assistant without getting hit by the robot arms when moving the instruments around, that sort of thing. So seems to be a big hit for us.
I think similarly, where this first one was deployed, obviously unique, we chose the academic center, because of just the surgeon engagement with it. That team that's there is very much, used to being kind of on the cutting edge and trying new things. So, they were excited about it and have kind of embraced it to this day. So similar experience to Ryan's, where we've had it now. And I think, what feedback that I've heard, I've worked more in the strategy role. I do visit that hospital and fairly close with the OR director and peri-op vice president, is that the learning curve and kind of training wasn't bad. It's like, you learn to drive a car and, the Toyota functions a lot like the Honda. Some things are different and there's some nuances, but once you've done it 4 or 5 times, it's kind of more second nature. And so that's kind of been the feedback that I've heard. So that's certainly positive, from our standpoint.
If a surgical assist is not available, do you feel the system helps you maintain efficiency during the case?
I think that, if you have to just define a surgical assist, you're always going to have somebody. If it's a scrub tech that's handing you instruments, they can, hold the fourth trocar for a gallbladder. For an inguinal hernia, you don't necessarily need an assist. And like I mentioned before, you stay scrubbed in. So for me, it's not like I'm having the bedside put in sutures or mesh. I can just stand up and go pull the robotic arm out of the port. And then that's a free port now because it doesn't hard dock to it. And you can drop whatever gear you need into the abdomen and keep working. So I think from an efficiency standpoint, I love to stay scrubbed in. I think it's hugely beneficial and gives me more control of the operation without having to rely on a more well-versed assist to change instruments or put stuff in the belly.
Is there enough room for the surgical assistants?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think there's more room and more space using this robot than with our traditional options.
Which procedures does outpatient robotics not make sense because of cost?
So, we look at costs a little bit from a clinical side of things. But I can tell you that, like I mentioned before, inguinal hernias, you could do thousands of inguinal hernias a year. If you're using traditional robotics, you're just not going to make money on those cases. You're kind of supplementing that robot with some of your inpatient robotics and higher acuity cases with higher RVU volume. So, you know, it comes down to what you're getting back on the charges that you're getting for these inguinal hernias and gallbladders and hysterectomies, et cetera. But that's going to be a per hospital, per ASC decision.
Next question. How have your procedure times evolved as your team gained experience with the system? How does this compare to what you were doing before?
Say that again for me.
Sure. How have your procedure times evolved as your team gained experience with the system? How does this compare to what you're doing before?
Yeah, we were a little bit slower and more careful, I think, just getting the nuances of docking's a little bit different, and the workflow is just a little bit different for the first few cases. But after the first handful of cases, our skin to dock time has been 2 to 3 minutes, which is very fast. And procedure time, while we was a little bit high during our learning curve, has really come back down to what our standard laparoscopic and robotic operative times are. So there's really no difference in what I'm doing now, other than which instrumentation I'm using.
What was your experience like training your OR team, both nurses and scrub techs, to set up and assist on Dexter cases?
So I have the luxury of having our simulation center, just like John has their sim center there. So we were able to get the first team that was going to do this into the sim center, where we could practice the draping and practice what it looks like to dock. So I think that when any time you're implementing a new technology, even if you don't have a sim center, you're going to want to get your specific team up to speed ahead of time. There's a training program that Distalmotion has that will run the team through both online and in person. And, just having a couple minutes of practice so that you can figure out the coordination team is beneficial leading into the first case. Once you're into those cases, and once the surgeon's done a few cases, it's very easy to teach the new scrub techs and nurses in the room on the fly.
And we have time for one final question here. Do you now have a dedicated or rotating team? How has that impacted scheduling?
Yeah, I have a rotating team now. We try to get the same team if we can, but obviously that doesn't always work. So basically whoever's there that day and gets assigned to the room comes in and does Dexter cases with me. Like I said, we've had travelers that come in. It would be their first Dexter cases, and they do great with the draping. The docking is very straightforward because we know kind of the angles that the patient parts need to come in for the cases that we do. So, I don't require a specific team any longer after the first few cases, and so now we just schedule, and it ends up in a room, and whoever's there gets to do the cases with me.
That's all the time we have for today. I want to thank Dr. Broderick and John for an excellent presentation, as well as Distalmotion for sponsoring today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us today, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, John.